For over 100 years, we've been told that Wuthering Heights is the ultimate story of eternal love, a tragic, forbidden romance so powerful it transcends death itself. But here's the spoiler: it's not. It's actually a story about a group of deeply unpleasant people systematically ruining each other's lives because they're too bored, too angry, or too narcissistic to stop. And if you think it's a romance, you've been successfully gaslit by a century of movie adaptations. Hi, it's Captain Spoiler here, overthinking pop culture. We're about to dive deep into spoiler territory, so consider yourself warned. The main problem with Wuthering Heights is that it's been fundamentally misread. This isn't a love story that happens to be tragic. It's a tragedy that was later dressed up as a love story. And once you read it that way, every romantic moment turns into something else entirely. With Emerald Fennell's new adaptation just around the corner, promising us dark desire and moody sensuality, it's time we strip away the cinematic gloss and the sweeping soundtracks. Today we're looking at what Wuthering Heights actually is: a violent, bitter, and emotionally corrosive study of obsession, control, and generational trauma.
God, I can't live without my life.
To understand why we've spent a century getting this story wrong, we have to talk about the erasure of the grim. It's a process where adaptations take the raw, ugly, and repulsive parts of a story and sanitize them to make them commercially digestible. It's like putting a beauty filter on a horror movie so you can sell it as a date night flick. Most adaptations, from the 1939 classic to the modern retellings, treat the moors like a picturesque backdrop for a photo shoot. But in the novel, this setting is a pressure cooker of domestic horror. They swap the literal filth, the smell of damp earth and the bruises, for misty meadows and perfectly tailored cravats. By erasing the grim, they aren't just changing the aesthetic, they're changing the entire meaning of the book. In the novel, the moors are a site of spiritual desolation. The landscape is an extension of the characters' internal chaos, raw and indifferent to human morality. When Brontë describes the wind wuthering around the house, she's describing a force that erodes everything it touches. This is a world where nature doesn't provide peace. It provides a mirror for the character's savagery. The mud, the thorns, and the biting cold are the physical manifestations of the emotional violence happening indoors. By cleaning up the moors for the screen, we lose the very thing that makes the story work: the idea that these people aren't governed by the laws of society, but by the brutal, unyielding laws of the earth itself. The irony is that Emily Brontë knew that we would try to romanticize this. She actually built the romantic lens into the book just to shatter it. Enter Lockwood, our narrator and the OG author of the Wuthering Heights delusion. He arrives from the city with his head full of literary tropes, desperate to see Heathcliff as a capital R romantic hero, a rugged, misunderstood recluse. Even after Heathcliff treats him with blatant, snarling hostility and refuses him basic hospitality, Lockwood's brain still tries to translate that into brooding charm. He is the proxy for every reader who looks at a red flag and sees a rose. But Brontë doesn't let that delusion last. She hits him and us with a series of brutal reality checks. First, the ghost at the window, then the atmosphere of the house itself. Lockwood stumbles into a family dinner that feels more like a hostage situation. He sees the way Heathcliff speaks to the young Catherine with a level of verbal venom that is genuinely sickening. By the time Lockwood leaves, he's no longer inspired by a grand love story. He's repulsed. He realized what we often refuse to, that he didn't find a romantic sanctuary on the moors. He stumbled into a crime scene that's still in progress. Then there's Isabella Linton. She is the ultimate victim of the Byronic hero myth. She's been trained by the novels of her time, just like we've been trained by pop culture, to see a brooding, violent man and think, I can fix him with my love. She sees Heathcliff as a tragic figure in a romance novel. The problem is, he sees her as a dog to be kicked. Brontë uses Isabella's brutal awakening to scream at the reader, this is not a hero. Heathcliff doesn't just brood, he hangs Isabella's pet spaniel from a bridle just to watch her suffer. He isn't a bad boy with a heart of gold. He's a force of nature that lacks a moral compass. So why does Hollywood keep ignoring this? Because a steamy romance with a toxic edge sells tickets. A complicated study of sociopathy and generational trauma? That's a harder sell. We've mistakenly tried to read Brontë in the same framework as Jane Austen. But while Austen writes about the social dance of finding a husband, Brontë writes about the primal scream of losing your soul. We know very little about Emily Brontë. She left no diaries, no letters explaining her intent. But we have the text. And the text is filthy. It's full of unforgivable acts and obsession. The raw, jagged landscape of the moors isn't a romantic setting. It's a literal manifestation of the psychological wreckage between these characters. We want it to be a love story because the alternative is much more uncomfortable. Because if it's not a romance, then what exactly is happening between Catherine and Heathcliff? If they aren't soulmates in a tragic love story, what the hell are they?
He's more myself than I am. Whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same.
To understand Catherine and Heathcliff, we have to stop looking at them as lovers and start looking at them as a single fractured identity forged in the fires of neglect. From the start, their bond was built on mutual survival rather than affection. Heathcliff was the ultimate outsider, treated as a cuckoo in the nest, met with systemic cruelty and dehumanization. For him, Catherine was the only person who didn't look at him with instinctive disgust. She became the symbol of everything the world denied him: belonging, validity, and a claim to the earth they walked on. And what did Catherine see in him? In a world that was already preparing to cage her in the rigid, suffocating role of a 19th century lady, Heathcliff represented a wild, untamable freedom. He was her escape. She identified with his status as an outcast because, on the moors, they could both pretend that the rules of society and the limitations of her gender didn't exist. But there is a layer to this bond that most adaptations are terrified to touch: the fact that they grew up, for all intents and purposes, as siblings. They shared a bed as children, they ate from the same bowl, and they were raised under the same roof as brother and sister. Hollywood usually tries to bypass this ick factor by aging them up at the start of the story to make the attraction feel more standard. But by erasing that pseudo-incestuous foundation, we lose the point. This isn't two strangers falling in love. It's two people who have never known a world without the other. It's a claustrophobic, regressive connection that blurs the lines between family and obsession. This is why they never learned how to turn that bond into a real relationship. Because they were so isolated and so deeply enmeshed from childhood, they became addicted to each other. When Catherine famously cries out, "I am Heathcliff," it's not a romantic confession. It's a terrifying admission of extended narcissism. She doesn't see Heathcliff as a human being with his own rights or feelings. She sees him as her own soul walking around outside her body. And because she views him as herself, she feels entitled to treat him with the same reckless cruelty she applies to her own life. She marries Edgar Linton with the arrogant assumption that Heathcliff, as a literal part of her, will simply stay in his place and accept it. Heathcliff's obsession is just as hollow. Rather than a person to be loved, he treats her as a territory to be reclaimed. Even after her death, he begs for her to haunt him. It's a parasitic bond. They don't want to build a life together. They want to consume each other until there's nothing left. Because they are so focused on this singular, obsessive loop, everyone else is just collateral damage. They treat the world as a stage for their private war. And unfortunately for everyone else, this war has no room for survivors.
My old enemies have not beaten me. And now would be the precise time to revenge myself on their children.
This is the part Hollywood really hates to show you. Because when two people decide that their epic connection justifies treating the rest of the world like garbage, the victims are usually the ones who can't defend themselves. We need to talk about generational trauma, the real, beating heart of this novel that most adaptations cut out to save time for more brooding stares. The second half of the book isn't about love, it's about the systematic, cold-blooded destruction of the next generation. Instead of mourning Catherine, Heathcliff uses his grief as a weapon. He becomes the architect of a living hell for 3 children who did nothing to him: Hareton Earnshaw, the younger Catherine, and his own son, Linton. Think about Hareton. He is the son of Heathcliff's old enemy, Hindley. Instead of being the bigger person, Heathcliff deliberately reduces the boy to a brute. He denies him an education, forces him into manual labor, and raises him in a house of pure hatred. Heathcliff recreates his own traumatic childhood in Hareton, just so he can watch it from the outside. Then there's his own son, Linton. Heathcliff sees him only as a legal loophole. He treats his dying, terrified son like a chess piece to gain control over the Linton estate. He forces a marriage between the younger Catherine and Linton through kidnapping and physical violence. This is where the romantic hero myth dies a permanent death. A man who punches a grieving girl in the face and mocks his son on his deathbed is not a tortured soul. He is an abuser who has fully embraced his role as a villain. But why did Brontë write this? Because she understood that trauma is a cycle. Heathcliff was made by the cruelty of the Earnshaws, and now he is making the next generation in his image. The only reason the story ends with a shred of hope is that the younger generation, Hareton and Cathy, eventually choose to break the cycle through genuine kindness. They do what Heathcliff and the elder Catherine never could. They see each other as actual human beings, not as extensions of their own egos. They heal where their parents chose to burn everything down.
So kiss me, and let us both be damned.
This sugar-coated vision of Wuthering Heights has a powerful grip on our collective imagination, and Emerald Fennell is about to add her own layer of gloss to it. From what we've seen in the trailers, her adaptation looks like it's going to be Saltburn on the Moors, dripping with dark desire, moody sensuality, and that specific aesthetic of forbidden fruit. But here is the ultimate twist. In the book, all that heat between characters doesn't even exist. Bronte's characters are actually remarkably, almost hauntingly, asexual. Their obsession is metaphysical. They don't want to sleep together. They want to be each other. There are no steamy encounters on the moors in the text. Most of what Hollywood puts on screen as passion has to be invented, filled in between the lines, because the actual book is too cold and too grim to satisfy a modern craving for romance. Of course, you could argue that this is just a product of its time. It's a Victorian novel after all. There were things you simply didn't put on paper in 1847. But that's a lazy excuse. Victorian authors were the masters of the unsaid. They knew exactly how to suggest physical tension, longing, or heat through metaphors, lingering looks, or coded language. But Brontë doesn't do that. She leads this story in a completely different direction. She intentionally keeps them cold because rather than about pleasure, their bond is about a spiritual, almost violent possession. By turning Wuthering Heights into a steamy drama, we aren't just reading between the lines, we're rewriting them. We're turning a warning about the death of the soul into a fantasy about the heat of the body. We make it something we can understand, something we can domesticate. At the end of the day, the history of Wuthering Heights on screen is a history of selective memory. We keep choosing to ignore the mud, the child abuse, and the sociopathy because we want to believe in a love that can survive the grave. We want the cinematic gloss because the truth, the grimy, violent text that Emily Brontë actually wrote, is a much harder pill to swallow. Does this make the movies bad? Of course not. You can still enjoy the sweeping soundtracks and the tragic chemistry of a Hollywood Heathcliff. There is a beauty in those adaptations, but it's a different beauty than the one Brontë intended. The real strength of Wuthering Heights lies in its ability to make us shudder. It's a masterpiece of nihilism that challenges us to look at the darkest corners of the human ego. So, next time you see a brooding hero on a windswept cliff, remember, the moors aren't a place for lovers, they're a place for ghosts. And maybe it's time we stop trying to turn those ghosts into soulmates. What do you think? Is Emerald Fennell's take a necessary update, or is it just the latest chapter in the long history of misreading Emily Brontë? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like this video, here's another one you might find interesting.